Hi everyone, this is Building Bytes. These episodes are excerpts from the Building Knowledge Base, available at info.building.inc. In these monologues, I will read research articles and thought leadership that we've published. If you learn something new, please consider following and leaving a positive review. Enjoy! Core Concepts 1. Foundations of Asset Legibility. Section 4. Readiness over Liquidity. Assets must be understandable and verifiable before they can become liquid, regardless of market structure. Overview. Readiness over liquidity is the principle that assets must become understandable, verifiable, and informationally complete before they can become liquid. Liquidity, the ability to convert an asset to cash quickly at a fair price, is often treated as a feature that can be added through market design, technological innovation, or regulatory change. In reality, liquidity is downstream of a more fundamental condition: confidence in the underlying asset. Markets facilitate exchange, but they do not create the preconditions for exchange. Those preconditions exist at the asset level. When an asset can be quickly evaluated, confidently underwritten, and efficiently transferred, liquidity follows naturally. When those conditions are absent, no amount of market infrastructure can compensate. In real estate, where assets are heterogeneous, long-lived, and informationally complex, this relationship between readiness and liquidity is particularly stark. The liquidity misconception. Liquidity is often treated as something that can be engineered through mechanism design. The implicit model is simple: list the asset on a platform, fractionalize ownership to lower the entry price, add a trading venue where buyers and sellers can meet, and liquidity will emerge. When transactions fail to materialize or remain sluggish, the explanation typically focuses on market conditions: insufficient demand, adverse macroeconomic environments, regulatory uncertainty, or structural factors like limited market makers or narrow distribution channels. These explanations are sometimes valid, but they often misdiagnose the problem. Many real estate assets are illiquid not because markets are poorly designed or demand is insufficient, but because the assets themselves are not ready to be transacted efficiently. They cannot be quickly evaluated without extensive manual investigation. They cannot be confidently underwritten without making assumptions that prudent capital providers find uncomfortable. They cannot be efficiently transferred because documentation is incomplete, ownership structures are complex, or compliance status is ambiguous. Liquidity tools, platforms, protocols, fractional ownership structures, cannot compensate for informational uncertainty. They can reduce transaction costs, widen distribution, and improve price discovery for assets that are already informationally sound. But when fundamental questions about an asset's condition, performance, or obligations remain unresolved, adding market infrastructure simply moves friction from one part of the transaction chain to another. Sellers struggle to find buyers. Buyers demand extensive contingencies or deep discounts, transactions that do not require disproportionate time and expense. What readiness actually means. An asset is considered ready when it can be reviewed and understood without reconstruction. This does not mean perfection, every possible question answered, every conceivable contingency addressed. It means sufficiency. The information needed to make informed decisions is available, organized, and verifiable. It means clarity. What is documented matches what exists, and the relationship between documentation and reality is transparent. Readiness includes several specific conditions. First, complete and consistent documentation. The records necessary to understand the asset's history, current state, and obligations exist and agree with one another. There are no material gaps, and where gaps exist, they are acknowledged and explained. Second, clear ownership and rights. Who owns what, who has authority to transact, and what restrictions or encumbrances apply are unambiguous and documented in forms that can be verified. Third, verifiable history and changes. Modifications, upgrades, and alterations are documented with sufficient detail to understand what changed, when it changed, why it changed, and who authorized the change. Fourth, alignment with applicable standards and regulations. The asset's compliance status is current, documented, and defensible, with evidence that requirements were met at the times they were applied. Fifth, structured data that supports evaluation. Information is organized in ways that enable programmatic analysis, comparison against benchmarks, and integration with analytical tools. Readiness is not a binary state. An asset is not simply ready or not ready. It is a spectrum. Assets can be more or less ready depending on how completely these conditions are satisfied. But there is a threshold below which transactions become prohibitively difficult, and that threshold is higher for institutional capital, regulated markets, and tokenized structures than for bilateral private transactions between sophisticated parties with high risk tolerance. Illiquidity is often informational. Many real estate assets are physically sound and economically viable, yet remain difficult to transact. They generate stable cash flows, occupy attractive locations, and serve their intended purposes effectively. Yet they sit on balance sheets for years, or when they do trade, transactions take many months and consume substantial resources. The constraint is rarely the physical asset. It is the informational layer surrounding it. Common causes of informational illiquidity include missing or outdated records, documentation that should exist but does not, or documentation that exists but has not been updated to reflect current conditions. Inconsistent reporting formats create friction when different systems or stakeholders use different structures to represent the same information, forcing translation and reconciliation. Unclear assumptions in financial models make it difficult for buyers to evaluate whether projected performance is realistic or what risks might cause actual results to diverge from projections. Undocumented modifications or upgrades means the asset's current configuration may not match its documented specifications, creating uncertainty about capacity, compliance, or maintenance requirements. These issues increase perceived risk because they force buyers and lenders to make decisions without full information. They slow diligence because resolving questions requires investigation, negotiation, and often inspection or testing. They narrow the pool of willing participants because many potential buyers or investors have mandates, risk frameworks, or regulatory requirements that preclude transactions where material uncertainty exists. Illiquidity is frequently a system of informational friction, the difficulty of transferring understanding from seller to buyer efficiently. Liquidity rewards confidence, not novelty. Markets respond to confidence. Assets that are easier to evaluate, easier to explain, and easier to verify attract more participants and move more quickly, regardless of whether they are traded through traditional channels or digital platforms. The mechanism of exchange matters less than the quality of information supporting the exchange. A well-documented asset can be liquid in a relatively simple market structure. A poorly documented asset will struggle to find liquidity even with sophisticated market infrastructure. Novel structures, fractional ownership, tokenization, real-time settlement may widen access by lowering minimum investment sizes, improving distribution, or reducing settlement risk. These are valuable innovations, but they do not replace the need for readiness. They assume it. A fractional ownership platform assumes that the asset being fractionalized can be valued with confidence. A tokenization protocol assumes that ownership rights are clear and that the represented asset's condition and obligations are verifiable. A real-time settlement system assumes that the information supporting the transaction is reliable enough to justify immediate finality. Without readiness, these innovations expose rather than solve underlying problems. Price discovery becomes unreliable because participants cannot agree on valuation without first agreeing on facts. Settlement becomes risky because post-transaction disputes arise from informational gaps that should have been resolved before closing. Compliance becomes more manual and reactive because documentation is insufficient to demonstrate adherence to requirements programmatically. Readiness ensures that when an asset enters a market, whether traditional or novel, participants can focus on price, terms, and strategic fit rather than reconstruction of basic facts. Readiness is cumulative. Readiness is not created at the moment of sale or refinancing. It accumulates across an asset's lifecycle, with each phase either contributing to or detracting from eventual transactability. Design decisions create constraints that affect future options. Choosing systems, materials, or configurations that are well documented and widely understood makes the asset easier to evaluate later. Choosing proprietary or unusual approaches without adequate documentation creates uncertainty that must be resolved through investigation or accepted as risk. Construction records establish what was actually built, as opposed to what was planned. When as-built conditions are documented accurately and deviations from design are captured with rationale, the asset's actual state is known. When construction documentation is incomplete or unreliable, uncertainty about the asset's true configuration persists indefinitely. Operations generate performance history that either confirms design assumptions or reveals how the asset behaves under real conditions. Systematic capture of operational data, energy consumption, maintenance interventions, system failures, builds evidence that supports valuation and underwriting. Absence of this data forces reliance on assumptions or comparables that may not reflect the specific asset's characteristics. Governance preserves continuity across ownership changes, system upgrades, and personnel transitions. When processes ensure that information remains accessible, accurate, and current, readiness compounds. When governance is weak or absent, information degrades even as the physical asset may be well maintained. Attempting to prepare for liquidity at the end, generating comprehensive documentation packages, conducting extensive inspections, reconstructing missing records, is possible but costly. It requires rebuilding context that should have been preserved, answering questions that should have been documented when decisions were made, and often making concessions or accepting contingencies because gaps cannot be fully resolved. Why this matters for tokenization. Tokenization is often presented as a shortcut to liquidity, particularly for asset classes like real estate that have been historically illiquid. The narrative suggests that representing ownership on a blockchain, enabling fractional participation, and providing access to digital trading venues will unlock liquidity by removing traditional barriers. In practice, tokenization exposes readiness gaps rather than circumventing them. Digital representations amplify existing problems. Data inconsistencies that might be negotiated away in bilateral transactions become systemic issues when encoded in smart contracts or presented to distributed participants who cannot easily negotiate. Documentation gaps that a single sophisticated buyer might accept become obstacles when multiple smaller investors need confidence in what they are purchasing. Unclear governance that might be tolerated in a private deal becomes untenable when ownership is distributed and decision-making must be coordinated across many token holders. Tokenization does not eliminate readiness requirements. It makes them unavoidable. Smart contracts cannot execute reliably if the data feeding them is unreliable. Token holders cannot evaluate their investments if underlying asset information is incomplete. Regulators cannot approve tokenized offerings if compliance cannot be demonstrated clearly. Secondary markets cannot function if buyers cannot verify what tokens represent. The technology is neutral. It reflects the quality of inputs. When those inputs are well prepared, tokenization can indeed improve liquidity. When inputs are poor, tokenization fails to gain traction despite technical sophistication. Liquidity is an outcome, not an input. Readiness over liquidity reframes the problem. Liquidity is not something that can be added to an asset through better market design or technological innovation alone. Liquidity is something that emerges when assets meet the preconditions that allow efficient transfer of ownership. Those preconditions are informational. The asset must be understandable. Its condition and obligations must be verifiable. Its documentation must be structured in ways that support evaluation. When these conditions are met, liquidity becomes a natural consequence rather than a forced outcome. Markets function because participants can transact with confidence. Prices reflect underlying value rather than discounting for uncertainty. Transactions proceed efficiently because diligence is straightforward. Broader participation is possible because the barriers to understanding the asset are low. Conversely, when these conditions are not met, no amount of market infrastructure will produce deep, sustainable liquidity. Assets may trade occasionally, but transactions will be sporadic, expensive, and concentrated among parties with specialized expertise or high risk tolerance. Why this concept matters. This concept explains why many liquidity initiatives in real estate underperform despite technical sophistication, significant capital investments, and favorable regulatory environments. Platforms are built, tokens are issued, trading venues are established, yet volumes remain low, spreads remain wide, and transactions remain concentrated in a small subset of assets. The typical diagnosis focuses on market structure, insufficient market makers, inadequate distribution channels, regulatory friction, or macroeconomic headwinds. These factors matter, but they are often secondary. The constraint is rarely the market. It is the asset's ability to be understood. Real estate is informationally complex. Buildings have long histories, heterogeneous characteristics, and context-dependent values. They generate obligations that extend years into the future. They are subject to regulations that vary by jurisdiction and evolve over time. Converting these complex, long-lived assets into liquid instruments requires not just better trading technology, but better information infrastructure at the asset level. Readiness is the quiet work that makes transactions possible. It involves systematic documentation, structured data, verification processes, and governance that ensures information remains current and reliable. It is less visible than market platforms and less exciting than tokenization protocols, but it is more fundamental. Liquidity is the visible result, the outcome that emerges when underlying information supports confident, efficient exchange. Focusing on liquidity without addressing readiness is building on an unstable foundation.